On August 12, 1819, a sturdy 87-foot whaleship named the Essex set sail from Nantucket, Massachusetts. At its helm was Captain George Pollard Jr., just 28 years old and on his very first voyage as a captain. He was joined by a crew of 20 men, a mix of seasoned veterans and fresh-faced newcomers, including cabin boys as young as 14. In 1819, Nantucket was the undisputed king of the American whaling industry. The entire island's economy ran on whale oil, a precious commodity that lit the lamps of America and Europe. Ships like the Essex were the lifeblood of this economy, embarking on grueling voyages that could last 2 or 3 years, all in the hopes of returning with a hold full of liquid gold. The Essex itself was no stranger to the sea. Built in 1799, it was a veteran vessel with a history of successful expeditions. Its owners had every reason to expect another profitable journey. They were after sperm whale oil, the best of the best. It burned brighter and cleaner than any other oil, fetching premium prices in every market. The crew was structured for this dangerous hunt. Experienced officers commanded teams of harpooners and seamen. Many came from Nantucket's own whaling dynasties, while others, seeking fortune and adventure, signed on from the mainland. Interestingly, in an era of segregation on land, the sea offered a different reality. 6 black sailors, including the steward William Bond, served alongside their white crewmates, a common practice on whaling ships that valued skill and courage above all else. The ship was a floating factory, perfectly equipped for the grim business of whaling. On its deck sat the tryworks, a massive brick furnace designed to render whale blubber into oil. The holds were packed with all the tools of the trade, giant iron tripods, razor-sharp cutting spades, and of course the deadly harpoons. Hanging from the sides were 6 wooden whaleboats, the nimble 25-foot crafts that would carry the hunters into battle. These small boats were the key to the entire operation, the fragile link between the men and their colossal prey. The plan was simple: sail to the rich whaling grounds, fill the barrels, and return home heroes. But from the very beginning, the Essex's voyage was anything but simple. Just 2 days out from Nantucket, disaster nearly struck. A sudden, violent squall slammed into the Essex, knocking the ship completely on its side. The terrifying ordeal cost them 2 of their precious whaleboats and left the ship with a damaged hull and battered masts. Captain Pollard faced a difficult choice: turn back for repairs or press on. He chose to press on. The crew made what temporary fixes they could at sea and continued their journey south, heading for the whaling grounds off the coast of South America. By January 1820, they faced their next great challenge: rounding Cape Horn. This treacherous passage at the southern tip of the continent was a brutal test for any vessel. For weeks, the crew of the Essex battled furious winds, monstrous waves, and freezing cold before they finally broke through into the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Now in the Pacific, they sailed north along the coast of Chile, entering the traditional hunting areas. By the middle of 1820, they had managed to catch several whales, but their hold was far from full. Whaling was a game of patience and incredible luck. Day after day, lookouts perched high on the masts, their eyes scanning the endless blue horizon for the telltale sign, the misty spout of a breathing whale. When a spout was spotted, the cry would go out and the organized chaos would begin. Crews would scramble to lower the whaleboats and row with all their might towards the distant giants. A skilled harpooner would stand at the bow, ready to strike. A successful throw meant the whale was tethered to the boat by a long rope, and the terrifying Nantucket sleigh ride would begin, with the tiny boat dragged through the water at incredible speeds by the wounded, panicked animal. With their progress slower than hoped, Captain Pollard made a bold decision. He'd heard rumors from other whalers of untouched whaling grounds, teeming with sperm whales, far out in the remote Pacific. He steered the Essex west, sailing about 1,500 miles from the South American coast. This move placed them in one of the most isolated spots on the planet, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest known land. It was a huge gamble, but the potential reward was a full cargo of oil and a triumphant return to Nantucket. In October and early November of 1820, the gamble seemed to be paying off. The crew successfully hunted several sperm whales. The tryworks on deck blazed day and night, filling the air with the thick, unmistakable smell of rendering blubber as barrel after barrel of valuable oil was stored below. The target of their hunt, the sperm whale, was the most valuable and by far the most dangerous quarry in the sea. An adult male could grow to 60 feet long and weigh up to 50 tons. Their enormous heads contained a unique waxy substance called spermaceti, prized for making the highest quality candles. These magnificent creatures were masters of the deep, capable of diving to incredible depths and staying submerged for over an hour. The dangers of hunting them were an accepted part of life for a whale. Everyone knew stories of boats smashed to pieces by a whale's powerful tail fluke, or of men tangled in harpoon lines and dragged to their deaths. But a whale deliberately attacking a ship? That was unheard of. Whales were known to flee or fight back when cornered and wounded, but the idea of one turning aggressor and ramming a vessel was the stuff of fiction. It had simply never been documented. The men of the Essex knew these risks intimately. They had been at sea for 15 months, following the same grueling but familiar routine. Wake before dawn. Scan the horizon. Lower the boats. Strike the whale. Process the carcass. Store the oil. Repeat. It was exhausting, perilous work, but it was their life. As November began, the rhythm continued. On the morning of November 20th, 1820, the familiar cry echoed from the masthead. "Tar she blows!" Spouts had been spotted on the horizon. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, preparing the boats for another hunt. It was a day that began like any other. The sun was out, the sea was calm, and there were whales to be had. No one on board the Essex had any inkling that they were sailing into the pages of history, about to become the subjects of one of the most harrowing and unbelievable maritime disasters ever recorded. The captain gave the order, the boats were lowered, and the men rowed towards their destiny, completely unaware that their world was about to be shattered. The morning of November 20th, 1820, dawned clear and calm. For the crew of the whaleship Essex, it seemed like just another day in the vast Pacific Ocean. They were far from home, about 1,200 miles west of the Galapagos Islands, sailing through an empty blue world. Around 8 o'clock, a lookout spotted whale spouts in the distance. The call went out, and Captain Pollard ordered 3 small whaleboats into the water. The hunt was on. Captain Pollard took one boat, his first mate Owen Chase took another, and the second mate Matthew Joy, the third. Each boat, with its 6-man crew, rowed hard towards the pod of sperm whales. Owen Chase's boat was the first to reach them. A harpoon flew through the air and found its mark. The whale, wounded and enraged, thrashed violently, its powerful tail smashing against the small boat, cracking the hull. Chase had no choice. He ordered his men to cut the line and row back to the Essex for repairs. While the other 2 boats continued the hunt, Chase and his crew got their damaged boat back to the mothership. It was around 9 in the morning. They hauled the boat partially out of the water and started patching it up with canvas and nails. On the deck of the Essex, the remaining crew watched their shipmates in the distance, still chasing after the giants of the deep. The Essex drifted slowly with just a few sails set. Suddenly, around 9:20, a crewman shouted. He pointed to a whale, a truly massive one, lying motionless on the surface only 100 yards away. Chase stared at it. He estimated it was 85 feet long. A giant even for a sperm whale. It just floated there, spouting a few times. Then it started to move. Slowly at first, but with clear purpose, it swam directly toward the Essex. The whale picked up speed, its massive body cutting through the water. Chase watched, his heart likely pounding as it closed the distance. He estimated its speed at about 3 knots. It was aiming straight for the ship's bow. There was a deafening crash as the whale struck the Essex, right at the waterline. The force was incredible. The entire ship shuddered from bow to stern, its forward motion brought to a dead stop. The whale passed underneath and surfaced on the other side. Chase immediately scrambled to check the damage. It was bad. Water was pouring into the forecastle through splintered planks. He yelled for the men to start the pumps. 2 sailors went below and came back with terrifying news. Water was rising fast in the hold. Chase ordered distress signals to be raised, trying to call the captain's boat back. Then, the whale reappeared. It surfaced about 100 yards off the port side, looking stunned or perhaps injured from the impact. It just stayed there, its enormous head pointed towards the ship. Chase watched in horror as it began to thrash its tail and snap its massive jaws together over and over again. Then it turned and began swimming towards the Essex for a second time. This time it was faster, much faster. Chase estimated it was moving at 6 knots, its wake churning the sea behind it. It was a torpedo of flesh and bone aimed directly at the ship's port bow. Chase shouted warnings. Men scrambled towards the stern, bracing for impact. The whale struck with even greater force than before. Its head smashed through the hull planks near the cathead with a sound that echoed across the quiet ocean. The ship shook violently as the whale's head penetrated several feet into the hull. Then it pulled back and disappeared beneath the waves. Water rushed into the gaping hole. Chase ran below deck again. The forward hold was already waist-deep in seawater and rising fast. The pumps were useless. The ship was sinking. He returned to the deck and gave the grim report to the terrified crew. The Essex was going down. He ordered them to cut away the remaining whaleboats and gather whatever supplies they could. The ship began to settle, bow first, into the Pacific. Captain Pollard's boat was about half a mile away when the attack happened. His crew saw the whales strike their ship, but from that distance, they couldn't understand what they were seeing. They rowed back as fast as they could. By the time they reached the Essex around 10 o'clock, its bow was already deep in the water, the deck tilting at a sickening angle. "What has happened?" Pollard asked, his voice full of disbelief. Chase could only tell him the unbelievable truth. A whale had rammed their ship twice and stove in the bow. Pollard just stared at his sinking vessel, speechless. Soon, the third boat returned, and all the men gathered alongside the foundering ship. They had maybe 30 minutes before she was gone. A frantic scramble began. They salvaged what they could. 200 pounds of hardtack bread, 65 gallons of water, 2 live tortoises they had kept for food. They grabbed navigational instruments, muskets, pistols, and a few tools. They tried to get to the main provisions in the forward hold, where thousands of gallons of fresh water and barrels of pork were stored, but the rising water had already claimed them. They could only watch as their best hope for survival disappeared into the flooded hold. They loaded everything they had salvaged into the 3 small whaleboats. Around 11 o'clock, the Essex finally gave up. It rolled onto its side, its masts stretching out across the water. The oil casks in its hold kept it from sinking completely, turning it into a floating, waterlogged wreck. 21 men now stood on the exposed side of their broken ship, surrounded by an endless, empty ocean. Their situation was desperate. The nearest known land, the Marquesas Islands, was 1,200 miles away. The coast of South America was over 2,000 miles in the opposite direction. And the Hawaiian Islands, about 2,400 miles away, were a mystery to them, their exact location unknown. They were adrift in 3 tiny boats, each just 25 feet long, designed for short hunts, not long voyages. Each boat was now crammed with 7 men and their meager supplies, with very little freeboard between them and the waves. Captain Pollard ordered sails rigged on the boats. The men scavenged wood and canvas from the wreck to create makeshift covers, offering minimal protection from the sun and rain. They divided the food and water. Each boat received about 21 pounds of bread and 22 gallons of water for its 7 men. The officers discussed their options. They were afraid to sail towards the Marquesas or Hawaiian Islands, having heard terrifying stories of hostile natives. So they made a fateful decision. They would sail for South America, a journey of more than 2,000 miles, hoping the winds and currents would be in their favor. On November 22nd, after 2 days of frantic preparation, they were ready. They took one last allotment of bread from the floating hulk. At noon, the 3 small boats set sail, leaving the wreck of the Essex behind. As they disappeared over the horizon, the hulk floated alone in the vast, empty Pacific, a silent monument to a disaster that was only just beginning. On November 22, 1820, 3 small whaleboats pushed off from the wreckage of their former home. The mighty whaleship Essex. They were tiny specks on an endless ocean, their future an unwritten page of desperation and hope. Captain George Pollard commanded 1 boat, First Mate Owen Chase the second, Second Mate Matthew Joy the third. Each boat carried 7 men, and their entire world was now confined to these fragile wooden shells. They sailed southeast, sticking together, a tiny determined convoy against the vast emptiness of the Pacific. Their provisions were shockingly meager. For 21 men, they had just 65 pounds of hardtack bread and a handful of water casks. The officers calculated it might last 60 days, but only if they were brutally strict. From day 1, the rationing began. Each man received a mere half pint of water and 1 small, dry biscuit per day. It was nowhere near enough to sustain them, especially under the relentless tropical sun. Their journey was a frustrating crawl. The ocean was a moody beast, offering either frustrating calms or unpredictable winds that did little to push them forward. When the wind died completely, the men had to row. The back-breaking labor only deepened their thirst and exhaustion, turning every stroke of the oar into a painful reminder of their dwindling water supply. By the end of the first week, the reality of their situation was biting hard. Supplies were already running dangerously low. The rations, already punishing, had to be cut even further. The men were wilting. Exposed to the elements day and night, with only the boat's gunwales for shelter, their bodies began to fail. The constant spray of salt crusted their skin, causing painful sores. Dehydration set in, bringing with it splitting headaches, debilitating muscle cramps, and a fog of confusion that made it hard to think. They were adrift not just on the water but in a haze of suffering. Then, on December 20th, a miracle. After nearly a month at sea and having traveled over 1,000 miles, they spotted land. It was Henderson Island, a small, uninhabited coral atoll. For men who had seen nothing but water for weeks, it was paradise. They stumbled ashore and found small pools of fresh water. They could finally drink their fill, a simple act that felt like the greatest luxury imaginable. They also found life, bird eggs, crabs, and shellfish. It was a feast. They spent a week on the island, recovering their strength, feeling human again. But their relief was short-lived. A week of exploring confirmed their fears. The island's resources were too scarce. It could not sustain 21 men for long. They had to make an impossible choice. On December 27th, as the others prepared to leave, 3 sailors made a different gamble. Thomas Chappell, Seth Weeks, and William Wright decided to stay behind. They reasoned that their chances of being found by a passing ship were better on solid ground than in a tiny boat lost in the vastness of the ocean. It was a heartbreaking separation. The remaining 18 men, their water casks refilled but their food stores still desperately low, pushed their boats back into the surf. Their new destination was South America, an almost unimaginable 3,500 miles away. They hoped to catch the trade winds that could carry them east. The replenished water was a temporary reprieve, but the specter of starvation returned almost immediately. The little food they had was gone in a flash. As the days bled into weeks, the men withered. They grew gaunt, their bodies consuming themselves. They chewed on leather from their shoes, anything to trick their stomachs into feeling full. In early January 1821, the first man died, then another. The grim reality was that a boat with fewer mouths to feed had a better chance of survival. As the bodies of their shipmates lay in the boats, a terrible and desperate idea took hold. They had to survive. In a final tragic act born of pure necessity, they began to consume the dead. It was a line they never imagined crossing, a horror that would haunt them forever. Their ordeal was far from over. On January 28th, a violent storm descended upon them. The waves were mountainous, the wind a screaming fury. In the chaos, the 3 boats were separated. Owen Chase's boat was tossed away from the others, lost in the squall. They would never see their captain or the 3rd boat again. Alone, they drifted eastward, their survival now dependent on the last grim resource available to them. Meanwhile, in Captain Pollard's boat, the situation was just as dire. The food was gone. There was nothing left. They turned to a dark old custom of the sea, a last resort for men in their position. They drew lots. One of them would have to be sacrificed so that the others could live. The lot fell to a young sailor, Owen Coffin, the captain's own cousin. In a moment of profound agony, Captain Pollard offered to take his place, to die for the boy. But Coffin refused. He accepted his fate with a quiet resolve. The act was carried out, and the survivors lived on. Not long after, another man died, and again, his body provided the sustenance for the few who remained. By late February, they had been at sea for over 3 months. They were skeletons, barely clinging to life, drifting thousands of miles from where they had started. Their minds and bodies were shattered. As for Matthew Joy's boat, it vanished after the storm. He and the 4 other men aboard were never seen again, their fate swallowed by the immense, indifferent Pacific. The few remaining survivors in Chase's and Pollard's boats were now just ghosts. They were too weak to properly navigate, too exhausted to even despair. They drifted on, sustained by a flicker of determination and the horrific means they had been forced to adopt. They were a testament to the raw, brutal power of the will to live, floating across an ocean that had taken nearly everything from them. Their journey was a descent into the deepest parts of the human experience, a story of survival at its most extreme and most tragic. Imagine this, it's February 18th, 1821. The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean stretches out, shimmering under the sun, about 300 miles off the coast of Chile. Captain William Crozier of the British merchant ship, the Indian, spots something unusual. A small whaleboat, drifting aimlessly. It appears deserted. He orders his crew to get a closer look. As they approach, a flicker of movement catches their eye. Inside, they find two men, barely alive, their bodies withered, their eyes vacant. They are Owen Chase and Thomas Nickerson. The crew hoists them aboard the Indian, but the men are so weak they can't even stand. They're given sips of water, tiny morsels of food. As strength slowly returns, a horrifying story begins to unfold. They are survivors from the Nantucket whaling ship, the Essex, which was sunk by a massive sperm whale 3 months earlier. 3 months. Let that sink in. They tell the rescuers that other boats from their ship might still be out there, lost in the endless blue. Despite a desperate search, no other survivors are found, and the Indian sets sail for Valparaiso, Chile. Just 5 days later, on February 23rd, hundreds of miles to the south, the American ship Dauphin spots another drifting boat. It looks like wreckage. But as they draw near, they too find two men, Captain George Pollard and Charles Ramsdell. They are skeletal, barely conscious, victims of unimaginable starvation. The crew of the Dauphin pulls them from the brink of death, slowly nursing them back to a state of awareness. They confirm the story. They too are from the Essex. The Dauphin also heads for Valparaiso, where in early March, the 4 survivors are finally reunited. It's a moment of relief, but also profound sorrow. They were the only ones left from the 15 souls who had set out in their boats from a remote island weeks before. An entire boat's crew, led by Matthew Joy, had vanished without a trace. But the story doesn't end there. Owen Chase, one of the first men rescued, tells the authorities in Chile about 3 other sailors they had been forced to leave behind on a desolate place called Henderson Island. They had no idea if these men were still alive. A ship in the port, the Surrey, agrees to alter its course and attempt a rescue. It's a long shot. On April 5, 1821, nearly a month and a half later, the Surrey reaches the island. And there, against all odds, they find them, Thomas Chappell, Seth Weeks, and William Wright, alive. They had survived for months, subsisting on a meager diet of birds, eggs, shellfish, and what little rainwater they could collect. The Surrey brings them to safety. In total, out of a crew of 20, only 7 men survived the Essex disaster. 14 perished. When the survivors finally returned to their home port of Nantucket in the summer of 1821, they became instant sensations. The news spread like wildfire. A ship, a massive 3-masted whaling vessel sunk by a whale? It sounded like something from a myth. The tale was almost too incredible to be believed. And as the harrowing details of their survival at sea emerged, the public was both horrified and captivated. Owen Chase, the first mate, wasted no time. That same year, he published his own account, a book titled Narrative of the Most Extraordinary and Distressing Shipwreck of the Whaleship Essex. It was a bestseller. The world was gripped by their story of endurance and the terrible choices they had to make to stay alive. The lives of the survivors were forever changed. Chase, despite the trauma, returned to the sea he knew so well, commanding whaling ships until his retirement. Captain George Pollard's fate was different. He was given command of another ship, but it too wrecked in a storm. After that, he was seen as an unlucky captain, a Jonah. He never commanded a vessel again, spending the rest of his life as a humble night watchman back in Nantucket, a man haunted by the ghosts of his past. Thomas Nickerson, who was just a teenage cabin boy during the disaster, waited decades before writing down his own memories of the ordeal, providing another invaluable perspective. The other survivors quietly resumed their lives at sea, carrying their silent burdens with them. The sinking of the Essex wasn't just a dramatic story. It had a real impact on the maritime world. Ship owners began to rethink emergency procedures. Vessels were equipped with better provisions for long-term survival. Navigational training was updated, emphasizing the importance of heading for the nearest known landmass, no matter how small, rather than attempting risky, 1,000-mile journeys across the open ocean, which is exactly the fateful decision the Essex crew had made. They had feared rumors of cannibals on the nearby Marquesas Islands, and so they chose a much longer, more dangerous route toward South America, a choice that sealed the fate of many. The incident also served as a stark reminder that sperm whales, the giants of the deep they hunted, could be incredibly dangerous and were capable of more than just smashing small whaleboats. And of course, the story's most famous legacy is literary. A young sailor and aspiring writer named Herman Melville became obsessed with the tale. He met people connected to the Essex, including Captain Pollard's son, and more importantly, he read Owen Chase's gripping narrative. The account of a vengeful, white-headed whale ramming a ship head-on planted a powerful seed in his imagination. That seed would blossom into one of the greatest American novels ever written. Moby Dick, published in 1851. The epic clash between Captain Ahab and the white whale, the central event of the novel, was directly inspired by this very real, very terrifying piece of history. Historians have since pored over the logs and accounts, analyzing every decision made by Captain Pollard and his crew. Why did they choose the longer route? It was a combination of fear, misinformation, and the sheer desperation of their situation. Had they sailed for the closer islands, the outcome might have been vastly different, but we can only speculate. The wreck of the Essex itself was never found. It slipped beneath the waves of the deep Pacific, its final resting place a mystery forever lost to time. The men who lived through it carried the psychological scars for the rest of their days. Some developed lifelong anxieties about food, while others were tormented by the memories of what they had endured. Their ordeal remains one of the most well-documented maritime disasters of the 19th century, a testament to both the fragility of human life and the indomitable will to survive. As for the whale, its motives remain unknown. Was it an act of defense? A territorial dispute? A simple, tragic case of mistaken identity? We will never know for sure. But the story of the Essex stands as a powerful, haunting encounter between humanity and the immense, untamable power of the natural world, a true story of survival that became the stuff of legends. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales from history. See you next time.